Hello, welcome to episode 156 of the Book Binge, where this week I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm doing another one of my sort of poll videos that I did once upon a time, where I asked a few friends, acquaintances, some of these people are people who watch the channel occasionally, basically where they fall on a mood reading versus TBR reading scale. I didn't get a whole lot of unique responses, but I got about 28 or so, so I was able to split these people up approximately into 4 different categories, and was keeping tabs on it so that I could make a video about it because it interested me at one point in time. I made this a question of the day kind of thing to, gauge people's responses, where people fall on the scale, like I said. This is one where we're all readers, but not all of us go about reading the same way, and I wanted to see where different people fell. In the construction of this video, there might be some numbers here that might not make sense if you went back to that question of the day, for example, and actually gauge responses. I had to determine based off of what people's comments were versus what their votes were, and basically pick a balance of where different people fell on a scale. As for the scale, I have split people into the scheduler crowd, so people who basically always schedule; the structured crowd, people who usually schedule, maybe throw in a random thing every once in a while; the fast and loose crowd, people who tend to kind of pick up and read as they see fit, but have a couple things that they plan ahead of time, maybe read-alongs or whatever, but most of their reading is just kind of based off of their mood or what's more immediately interesting to them. And then you have the pick up and play crowd, which is the people who basically never plan anything, because if they plan to read a book ahead of time, they start reading it and they just don't want to read it, because the only way they can enjoy reading a book is if they just pick it up off of a mood reading kind of desire. So based off of these 4 crowds of people, there were 4 people who fit the scheduler crowd, and some of the reasons why they put themselves into this category, or why I had to fit them there, were because of explanations of being too easy to start too many things and inevitably not finishing any of those things. This is particularly a struggle that I personally tend to have. If I give myself free rein to just start whatever books are interesting to me in any given moment, I'll have 15 different books going on, and 5 or 10 of those books won't get finished. Not because I wasn't enjoying the books, but because I just don't have the time or attention span or the ability to have that many reads going on at the same time. Certain people fall into the scheduler crowd because they simply really enjoy making lists, and scheduling can be a super satisfying and fun thing to do. I totally get this as well. Just, planning out a reading schedule, whether that's a month ahead or a few months ahead, or planning multiple read-alongs with different people so you have an idea of what your reading is going to be like for most of the year, whatever have you. I think that making lists can definitely be a fun and satisfying thing, and different people definitely expressed this opinion. Plus, being able to cross things off of a list when you get it done is its own kind of satisfying and fun. The structured crowd was composed of 8 people. Read-alongs tend to dictate some amount of schedule, but they fill in others when available. Though their schedule tends to be mostly comprised of their own picks, their own reads, books that they just want to read on their own time, but they do have a few read-along books to fit in as they need to, just based off of what they've planned ahead of time with other people. So things that their personal reads kind of have to work around. So they have a little bit of a schedule in which to place their personal mood reads in, which I guess can actually make things a little bit easier for people. Certain people will simply make a pile of books, say, for example, on a desk or by their bedside or whatever. That doesn't necessarily have to be an end-all be-all schedule and order of which they have to read those books, but they have an idea of broadly what they're going to be reading over the coming future, the near future, we'll say. This is generally how the structured crowd functions. The fast and loose crowd was made up of 12 people, and really just tends to be the most practical in life, between having school and personal TBR stuff, and maybe even work, depending on what your work is. If you have to do a bunch of reading and studying stuff, if you're an appraiser like Patrick is, or if you happen to be in college, and especially if you're taking courses that have a lot of assigned readings in one way or another, or even high school English class, for example. If you have things that you personally want to read, but you have to also fit in other things because of other obligations, kind of having a fast and loose schedule where, hey, I have time to just pick up a book of my own, let's read this. And then, hey, we just had this book thrown at us for English class, I guess I gotta read this now, kind of thing. So you kind of have to just play it by ear and do whatever works for the schedule at any given point in time. Sometimes people also feel like they've got to switch to random audiobooks if eyeball reading time is short, or vice versa. If, whatever they're doing is too attention sucking that they can't concentrate on an audiobook, then they have to find some other time to read something sometime else or somewhere else. Some of these things can definitely dictate how the fast and loose crowd operates. And then we have the pick up and play crowd, as I've called them, which was comprised again of 4 people. So you'll see we have a sort of standard distribution chart here: 4, 8, 12, 4. So like really, if you average that 8 and 12, you have a perfect standard distribution. I was surprised by these results a little bit. I expected there to be a bit more people on the scheduler side and the structured side than on the fast and loose side, for example. But anyway, we do have the pick up and play crowd finally. Like I said, 4 other people on this end whose general reason for feeling this way are because they just can't find themselves enjoying reading or having a fun time if they already planned out reading ahead of time. So like there are certain authors, for example, like Stephen King, who write books and have a hard time writing books if they've already outlined because they feel like they've already written the book if they've done the outlining. I think that like some sort of similar principle might be happening here, where people, if they plan to read a book, feel like their mind has been spent planning to read that book long enough, or whatever it is, enough ahead of time, that when they actually go to pick up the book, they're no longer really that interested in reading it. Some people just struggle with this. Also, some people feel like reading is meant to be fun, and following the heart leads to a better connection oftentimes, and some people fall on this end of the spectrum as well. I was rather enlightened to hear some of the reasons how or why certain people fall on different ends of the spectrum. Where I fall in this example, you may have noticed by my relating to certain points in the first crowd, is I am very much a scheduler. Generally speaking, my schedule, my TBR each month is a little bit more in the structured crowd set of things, but in my heart, I prefer to be a scheduler. I plan to have all of my reads planned out and more or less a order that I plan to go in them, because if I play fast and loose, if I include random things now and again, that can definitely upend parts of my schedule and end up pushing things off that I don't want to push off, and like that tends to bug me a bit. So I tend to be a scheduler. At the start of the channel especially, I was number 1 pretty solidly. Everything that I read each month was read in order as best as I could manage to do so. Nowadays, as I've kind of suggested, I'm more in between number 1 and 2. I would still consider myself closer to 1 because that's where I am in spirit, but some months I'm closer to 2. It really depends on what's going on and how busy my reading schedule is, and how busy some of my other projects are on top of it. I mood read some things, but even most of my mood reads I pick up from a list of what I want to get to sooner than later, kind of like that, shelves on the bed or books stacked on the bedside kind of thing. That's generally where I fall. So like I plan as much of my TBR as I can, and sometimes I fit in other random things as I can or need to, just based off of what kind of time I have over the course of a month. An example, as I went into in a video a little over a year ago, I think at this point, that was basically how I determined my TBR. I have my big reads that I have scheduled or planning 4 months in advance. Oftentimes these are like big series or books that I really plan to get to, and I set them in firm dates several months in advance, so I know I'm getting to that because that's high priority sort of situation. Then I generally have a read along or 2 or buddy reads that I plan a few months in advance depending on when it happens. Like sometimes if I have a little bit of an open month, it's just okay, we can kind of do this thing next month. Generally it'll be a few months in advance, or maybe even further in the case of certain exceptions. I'll plan a series out or trilogy or whatever and be like, hey, I plan to do this buddy read, I plan to do this trilogy in this order in these months or whatever, so that I can plan ahead for that as well. I prefer to be able to plan ahead for my reading so that I'm not scrambling a couple of weeks before a month, so that I can figure out what it is I'm going to read. That's actually what I've been doing recently. I've been planning my next month's TBR and coming up with what I read over this previous month, and it's been kind of stressful actually, because I didn't realize that I had this month planned out perfectly, like a lot of it ahead of time. Next month I didn't have planned at all. So like I went to that and I'm just like, oh goodness, why didn't I plan any of this ahead of time? I kind of beat myself up for it. So that kind of tells you where I fell and why. But then on top of all of these things, I tend to also have shorter and quicker reads that I throw in on a little bit less notice, where like say a couple weeks ahead of time I'll be like, I want a palate cleanser with some of these other things that I plan to read. Let's make it, say, this book that I've been meaning to get to, or this book that I am falling behind on, or whatever the case may be. I do some of those things sometimes. And then I also have a stack of palette cleansers and easy reads available on short notice that, like, if I especially short stories now, because I've been doing short story Sundays every other week. Sometimes if like I have a very short amount of time that to read something when I don't have the time to read something else for whatever reason, I can just throw in a short story and be like, okay, this is when I'm going to read this short story, and then I'll cover that on the channel, and everything works. I sometimes read random books on a complete whim. It doesn't happen very often. Usually if it happens, like there's some idea going into it. For example, like maybe I'll mood read Valor by John Gwynne soon. That won't be on a complete whim because I've been thinking about that for a couple months. When I started Anna Karenina last December, I had actually planned to read that ahead of time, did not think I could and decided not to, but then decided to pick it up on a whim anyway because like I did, and even though I maybe shouldn't have. Sometimes I do this, but almost all of my books that I read in any given month are planned 1 to 3 months, if not further ahead of time, depending on what it is. Plenty of my biggest reads for this year, for example, when I'm reading like The Wheel of Time and stuff, has been planned since the beginning of the year, if not earlier, more or less. So, it seems more people tend to do a bit more of the mood reading on their schedule than I was anticipating, whereas I fall much further on the scheduler side, so I was anticipating, just based off of that and some of the other acquaintances that I have, to have, more people following on that end of the spectrum. But it turned out I was a little bit surprised, so that's a fun thing that data tends to do. Read-alongs and reads for school are similar and have enough hold that reading just whatever the rest of the time actually works. I totally understand why people tend to mood read a little bit more often. I'm just surprised that it was as many people as it was. If you're watching and you didn't participate in this poll or this conversation when it happened, let me know which of these crowds you tend to fall into, and if you have any additional reasons why you might fall into that crowd that weren't already covered, please also let me know those things in the comments below. Speaking of, scheduling TBR and talking about the last month's reading, I'll have my next monthly reading wrap-up and TBR video coming out next Tuesday, and I hope to see you guys there.